Пошли. Пошли! Назад. Назад, пошли. Ты войти. Клинит у меня ствол.
Greetings, friends. I want to talk about some observations about modern warfare. Most of these observations are drawn from what the war between Russia and Ukraine since 2022 has shown us. The first observation would be the revolutionary nature of drones. Drones have become the chief killer on the battlefield. In the beginning of the war, it was shells from artillery. Now it has become drones. Drones are terrifying. They introduce a reality where everything is surveilled. There is no more hiding. When both sides are operating, they know that they're being fully observed. Although there are some cases where they try to attack at night and they use thermal blankets to shield themselves from the sensors of the drones. So there are some attempts to hide, but generally when you're operating on campaign, you assume that you are fully observed by drones. Both sides can utilize the same technology. So the US military that invaded Iraq in 2003 would be entirely under-equipped to deal with the modern reality of drone warfare. Now, I'm not saying they haven't adapted, we'll find out, but I'm just saying that that kind of warfare that occurred back then with tanks and bombing and artillery still applies, but it's not enough. It's not nearly enough today. And the thing about drones is they're cheap. They can destroy tanks which cost millions and millions of dollars for the cost of only maybe $1,000. Tanks developing cages, this is now standard practice on both sides. They have huge cages to protect themselves from any angle of attack by drones. It usually takes more than a few drones to knock out a tank, but drones are cheap so they can expend many of them. But if you have these cages, it's going to make it more difficult. And likewise, you see roads, logistics roads, any of the main arteries for supply, for moving troops to the front, for getting the wounded out. These roads have to be covered by nets to keep the drones out. Now, if the drones get through the nets, then you're in a bit of a bad situation. Thermal blankets at night to protect your heat signature from the drones, but only works for a few moments because eventually you will heat up the blanket and then they'll be able to see you, but it's a temporary measure. So the second observation would have to do with attritional warfare. The point about attritional warfare, which applies to more than just World War I, but World War I was one of the best modern examples of attritional warfare. That case has certainly been illustrated in the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because that's not what the Americans would have been employing in Afghanistan or in Vietnam or in World War II, although you could argue that they may have lost in Afghanistan and Vietnam for attritional reasons to some extent. But that's not how modern warfare was thought best to be handled. through a attritional model. And originally, Russia wanted to avoid an attritional war first. They gambled with their quick advance on Kiev, and it nearly pulled off a diplomatic victory. But once that failed, they had to resort to Plan B, which was attritional war, which they knew would always work, but they wanted to avoid it because it takes time and money and commitment over many years. And the US doesn't have the morale and the logistics and the economy to actually wage the war in Russia's backyard, because this is occurring in their backyard. We can think of the elephant versus the whale. The whale was based on a maritime power like the British Empire, now superseded by the global American empire. The elephant would have been Russia, a land-based power, or China, a power with many soldiers and many men. Even during the Soviet Union, the Russian army would have dwarfed the American army in terms of manpower and missiles. So whereas China or Russia operate as land powers, as elephants, the US operates as a whale, as a maritime power, a trading power, well, formerly an industrial power. It has ceded a lot of that. So what we see instead is a full court press. The Russians constantly putting pressure on the Ukrainians all along the front lines, making advances here and there, never allowing the Ukrainians a chance to regroup and re-strengthen their battalions. There are no big arrow offensives in this war. It is unlike World War II in that regard. There are no huge advances except for the very beginning of the war, which probably did cost the Russians a lot of casualties because it's too costly and dangerous to attempt big arrow offensives these days. Russia understands that, and you won't be seeing any final pushes dozens of kilometers. Well, there have been some big advances, but if they want to drive all the way to the Dnieper, they could do that, but you'd lose thousands of men doing it. Why not just wait some months and allow the enemy to weaken so you can advance more steadily then? We do see Russia advancing quickly at times, but generally it is a slow advance. And this builds up into my next point, my next observation, which is that people don't understand that because Russia is not claiming Ukrainian territory at a very fast pace, that they will not win the war, or that it will take them 30 or 40 years to reach Kiev, because at the rate of territorial acquisition by the Russians, it would take them decades before they reach the Dnieper River. None of these people have ever played real-time war strategy games, because if you played a game like Warcraft 2, you would know that you get hit by the enemy, or there's a big clash somewhere on the map. Maybe it's near your base. Maybe it's near a valuable gold mine that both sides want. Just like in World War II, there was clashes far out in Russia near oil fields. There's big clashes way out in some certain area of the map. A big loss of men maybe on both sides, and that's where the thing is decided. That's where the outcome of the struggle is decided. The enemy may struggle on for a few more cycles. They may try to build some more men, but often what happens in Warcraft 2 is there's a big clash, and then I build up my army, and then I march over to finally finish off the enemy, and there's no one home. There's no one left because they already expended all of their men, so you just burn a ghost town. That could be Ukraine, because they're expending all of their men in certain areas, which is the Donbass. The Donbass was a series of fortified cities, which they fortified since the coup in 2014 up to Russia's invasion in 2022. They were fortifying Bakhmut, which fell. Avdiivka was one of their main bases, which fell. There was also Vuhledar. That fell eventually. That cost the Russians many casualties because these were hard to capture places. There was also Chasiv Yar, which I believe has fallen. I don't remember. Pokrovsk was one of the last ones, and that is presently in a very perilous state. Once you get past these fortified cities, the terrain changes from the slightly hilly terrain of the Donbass to more flat territory all the way up to the Dnieper River. That's much more easy to traverse. There's no natural defenses there, and I don't think the Ukrainians have built many defenses in advance like they did in the Donbass. Another separate point, I would say, maybe this relates to the big open spaces, are the laying of mines. There are many landmines in this war, and this means that it's a huge obstacle for troops And that is why these land mine clearing machines have been utilized, and they're extremely important. They're often the things that are getting hit by drones because they're literally right out on the front before any tanks can advance, before any troops can advance. You have to clear a path through these minefields, and you often need several of these engineering vehicles. They look kind of like agricultural vehicles to go over, farm fields, pre-explode the bombs in a way that doesn't destroy the whole vehicle, and therefore taking the brunt of any shells or drones and clearing a way for your side to begin to advance. Another observation is the porous nature of the Ukraine war, and this is a way in which perhaps it does differ from World War I, where there were solid lines. World War I had continuous trench lines that were connected, whereas in Ukraine it's been like isolated bastions. Here there's many situations, it seems, where you think the front line is in one place and the enemy's line is in another, but actually there's reports of enemy detachments moving through contested territory constantly. We've seen this with regards to Pokrovsk. There have been for weeks now reports of Russians moving through the center of Pokrovsk, but the Ukrainians remain holed out in certain areas, and the Russians bypass them apparently, or there's intermittent fighting in between them. So this is another aspect of the war that you can try to figure out if you follow the Telegram channels and you try to follow the journalists who actually are relatively close to what's going on. But I don't have the patience to do all of that work. It doesn't really matter. The point is there's an uncertainty and there's a new element of fluidity in modern warfare, especially utilizing motorcycles. The Russians pioneered the use of motorcycles. Of course, the Ukrainians do it as well, because you can advance quickly on an enemy position, and it's harder for drones to catch a speeding motorcycle than it is to catch like just a guy running or trying to duck out of the way. Of course, the motorcycles can still be taken out by drones, but it did provide some advantage in trying to escape them. I'm not saying this didn't exist in the past. That's what cavalry would do. Cavalry would run out into the countryside, run behind the enemy. But here we have a situation where there's even bastions that are planted where they are, overlapping with enemy positions in these certain cities, in these certain contested areas. And that can go on for weeks. The last observation is that there are no human wave tactics on either side. The Russians don't throw hundreds or even dozens of their men to be slaughtered in an attempt to take Ukrainian positions, and the Ukrainians don't do that either, because that's madness. Now, the Ukrainians have done some pretty crazy things in terms of, there have been so many cases where the Ukrainians have not ordered their men to retreat, and then their men end up getting killed or captured. That's happened quite a lot, but they don't order meat wave attacks. What both sides employ is small advances of 5 to 7 men. That's it. 5 to 7 men working as best they can in their unique circumstances for local advantage, to get a local advance. If you just say, okay, we're going to move the whole line up 1 kilometer, everyone along, you get a lot of people killed that way from drones or minefields or mud or whatever other geographic feature, or the quality of the soldiers you have here and there. Generally, these 5 to 7 men have to work to go out and attack probably another small outpost of Ukrainians. And often they have to skip from one patch of forest to another, because the Ukraine has a lot of these open fields where you're completely exposed, where it's extremely dangerous, but then a lot of these forest patches in between. Once you get into the forest patches, it's harder for the drones. That's the state of modern warfare. Has America adapted to that? Has Canada adapted to that? Certainly not Canada. Has Britain adapted to that? Probably not. I mean, just in terms of fighting forces, think of how small Britain's military would be, and I'm not saying Canada has a big military, we're probably even less, but compared to the military Ukraine had before the Russian invasion in 2022, how many quality fighting men could Britain field compared to the Ukrainian military? Probably 1% of the Ukrainian, 2% of the Ukrainian military. I mean, I'm just guessing, but somewhere around there. The US is a different story. They have a big military. But in terms of technology and tactics, they best pay attention. Hasta luego, amigos.